So to hopefully aid that digestion, we're now going to hear from our first panel of the day that will discuss the latest developments helping to shape the connected TV landscape. They'll be looking at partnerships, players, and performance in connected TV advertising. And don't forget, we want your involvement in this too, so you can submit your questions using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screens, and we'll review these questions and put a selection of them to the panel at the end of the session. So back over to you, Daniel, for your panel.
Thank you very much, Ryan. A warm welcome to this fantastic panel. I'm particularly pleased that we have perspective of ad tech agencies and also streaming services, etc. So we got Wale from Magnite, we got Patrick Morrell from the Trade Desk, Vicky Fox from OMD, and last but not least, Bart Sieswerda from Rakuten. So thank you very much for joining. And as an opening question, I'm keen to see what trends that I showed in my presentation did resonate with you particularly, and which other things do you think would be relevant to understand the emerging CTV landscape in Europe? Vicky, would you like to start with a UK perspective?
I certainly can. It was really interesting to see how far potentially the UK is ahead of this, and I think that gives us interesting perspective and sets us up with some challenges, because we need to make sure we get our measurement and our definitions and our processes and our structure, which I'm sure we'll come on to talk about in a minute, but it gives a big responsibility for us to start leading the way in this. So I'm very excited about that.
And Ed, I know you have looked at a European perspective for a long time, so you have a good understanding of the different markets. When you look at what I showed in terms of statistics and what you just heard Vicky say, how do you assess the state of development in Europe more broadly?
Hey Daniel, thanks so much for all of the content you just shared there. I think from my perspective, it's just there's so much going on in this space, whether it be the bounce back from the pandemic, the general programmatic adoption. For me, I thought the explosion of the streaming services, love that slide, I'll be taking that. That was the thing that most hit me. I think the pandemic's obviously accelerated new media consumption habits, but also buying patterns as well. So it'll be interesting to see how I think advertisers are likely to lean in as we're coming out of the pandemic to capture new customers that might be changing their behaviors, or even retain customers that they may see. And I think you touched on the definition point. I don't want us to go down that rabbit hole. We could be here all day on that point, but I think the CTV definitions aren't perfect at the moment precisely because of that pace of change. With regards to Europe, yeah, UK certainly ahead, that's how we're seeing it, but many strategies, I think, to combat new entrants are being replicated across the markets if of course on the other side viewing patterns might be disparate market by market.
Yeah. And Bart, you have a particular expertise on the Benelux and the Nordics. Benelux, in particular the Netherlands, always a first mover market. The Nordics with a very high pay TV penetration and very mature markets in that regard. I focused, of course, on the European Big Five in my presentation. What trends do you see in the Nordics and the Benelux if you relate it to the stats that I showed?
To be honest, I think it's always, you're not the only one to look at EU5 only. And for me, that typically is a benefit internally because I get some more freedom to explore some new ideas and thoughts around how we go to market in most of my markets. And even though you'd think that the Benelux and Nordics are very similar in terms of programmatic adoption and CTV strategies, etc., I think the Netherlands is well advanced in that. And I think in some of the markets in the Nordics, they're really catching up. Although I do see that the differences per market are really big. I think a market like Sweden is very much dominated by BVOD players who haven't really seen a lot of CTV in general. Whereas in the Netherlands, it's becoming more common, and in the UK, obviously, it's already been there for quite some time. So in terms of also viewing numbers, they really start picking up, and we've seen tremendous growth over the last year, I would say. So I think in terms of the numbers that you showed, I think we're really seeing an uptick in demand from all sides. So I think it's more around defining a CTV strategy in most markets, and especially some agencies are trying to now define what that should look like, especially in some of the markets in the Nordics. But overall, I think we're...
And Patrick, of course, CTV is a cornerstone of the Trade Desk strategy, and I always enjoy pouring through your SEC filings to count the number of mentions of CTV. When you relate the kind of CTV story, which seems to be focused on the US, and compare what's happening in Europe from a demand perspective, what are you seeing?
Yeah, I think it's been a very interesting journey. If we look back 2020, as you say, most of the focus was on the US. A lot of the narrative and a lot of the stories were, look how successful CTV has been. Here are some statistics from the US. And I think within Europe, and particularly the UK, I think 2020 was an education year. It was all about telling people what connected TV is, allowing people to understand who the players were, and also educate why they can't do exactly what was going on in the US. So we had that year of letting them know who the players are, the new people such as Bart in terms of the Rakutens or the Pluto, Samsung TV Plus. There are new operators out there. 2021 feels like the execution year, where teams like Vicky's team and others in the market have started to understand the market and who is out there and the opportunities out there, and started really adopting that and moving their budgets into that space. And what we're seeing, particularly this year, our own figures are showing 10 times growth in CTV just in Europe. So there really is a trend, an upward trend in that market. And we're going to see more of that as more players come into the market and better measurement tools and coming in as well.
And was it 10x growth? Is that in terms of consumption, inventory, or is it in terms of revenue?
That's in terms of revenue. In terms of the consumption, that naturally has just been on an upward trajectory since 2019, when everything was starting to come into this, more AVOD providers coming in there. In 2020, we were talking about the consumption levels going through the roof, but that trend wasn't necessarily there. The investment wasn't following the eyeballs. Now what we're seeing is that catch up in services, people finding that adoption, realizing that those unique users are there, and they can complete that curve, as we like to talk about in TV. The ultimate goal is to increase your reach, your 1+ cover, and that's where we see people are using and finding the value in connected TV market.
Let me stay with you for a second, because I'm very keen to understand what changes have there been in how CTV is being bought. We know that programmatic is a part of CTV, but we come in particular in Europe from a very kind of supply constrained market. So from your demand perspective, how are advertisers changing how they're buying CTV, and what particular trends are you seeing?
Yeah, I think one of the most interesting areas around this was actually in your slides, in terms of looking at the different opportunities or the different DSPs, or the number of DSPs that people are using. That's getting consolidated. People don't want to learn different platforms. They don't want to go through different platforms and direct to media owners. They want to consolidate it. They want to make it easier. And that's what we're finding with connected TV. Early on in sort of 2020, there still was, and still is, a huge reliance on BVOD providers. The broadcasters, particularly in the UK, have a huge monopoly, both on the inventory, but also the revenue. So there was a huge reliance on that. And I think it was about opening up the opportunities and opening up the doors and showing that there are other providers out there. And what we've noticed is this shift in understanding, but also adoption to the OTT first publishers, as we would call them within the trade desk. And that movement has led to the revenue growth that I'm talking about, but also a natural evolution of programmatic products that are out there. BVOD providers have been using connected TV as a tool for many years. It's been there, but it's flipped in terms of going from 25% of inventory being on connected TV to now 75 to 85% of the likes of Channel 4 or Sky or ITV. So naturally, their investment in that area is going to be much larger from the technology perspective. And we're seeing that with the partnerships that we've recently done with Channel 4, offering PMPs. And these tools are really leaning in and interesting our digital first agencies as well. So the non-native TV buyers who are coming to the market and starting to realize the power that is in connected TV.
I need to come to Vicky for a second. Vicky and we had a great conversation actually last week about CTV. And Vicky, you shared some fascinating insights on how you as an agency have been rethinking on how you work with CTV. Do you want to share with the audience how your approach to CTV has changed in the way that you buy it and the way that you manage it?
Absolutely. And that's the important thing, because we cannot let agency structure and legacy structures get in the way of connected thinking, pardon the pun. But I think historically, and I think it goes back to what Patrick's just said, because the broadcasters have been so dominant in the UK in CTV, a lot of the activations come through the AV, traditional TV investment teams. But over the last couple of years, we've seen video briefs coming through the digital teams and moving into CTV from two ways. So we've restructured MD this year to think about that and take advantage of that. And we have a connected performance team that we've joined together so that we have no silos. We've really accepted that the best way to respond to the briefs is to have one brief, one budget, and one plan, so that we don't get lost in agency structures, because so much of the data sets are now connected. So many of our partners, so people like the trade desk, are able to offer lots of different solutions through, as we said, this consolidation of the DSPs, and we have to reflect that in our structure, and that's exactly what we're doing future facing, definitely.
And Bart, from a kind of sell-side perspective, consolidation of DSPs, not letting agency legacy structures get in the way. When you look at your buyers, do you see these trends in practice?
Most definitely. I think what we've tried to do from the beginning is really make sure that we make our inventory as accessible as possible through any different means. We work together with Magnite, we work together with the trade desk and with a lot of other partners in the ecosystem to make sure that anyone can really access us from any point. But obviously, you do see that there are still some debates within agencies and within buyers, who's best placed to run these campaigns and who's best placed to plan these campaigns. And I think in some cases, that's the broadcast teams and the AV teams, and in other cases, the programmatic teams. And in some cases nowadays, you see that it's becoming a mix, right? And that's, I think, to Vicky's point. What we're also seeing is that now AV teams are getting involved, but the actual execution sits with programmatic teams. And more and more, you see that adoption of programmatic take a bigger impact, although that does depend on the market. In Southern Europe, that's a bit less typically, but in markets like the UK or in the Benelux and Nordics, definitely most of it is now being done programmatically.
Yeah, and we're going to come to this responsibility struggle in a second. And I think what really holds true with all that fragmentation, with new inventory, new players coming in, it has never been as simple as today. It only gets more complicated. But I need to disappoint you that we're not going to speak about the Nordics and the Benelux now, but because I want to go to Ed. At Magnite, you're launching a new piece of research on CTV focusing on the European Big Five. Can you reveal a little bit of what that's going to be about?
A sneak peek, yes, yeah, happy to. So yeah, this is the third research report actually that's come out of the Magnite team in the last 18 months. So quite interesting to run some comparisons pre, during, post. I wish we could say post-pandemic, perhaps we're not quite out of it yet, but really our goal is to try to better understand, the CTV audiences. What are they comprised of? What are their behaviors, their habits? How does that how are they differentiated also from a traditional linear TV only viewing audience? And we surveyed 5,000 respondents, 1,000 in each market, and we looked at a number of different attributes and aspects, and the report also contains contributions from partners like Samsung and Trade Desk, so it's definitely a read when it launches next week. Just to pull out a couple of the top line stats, what we found was actually the CTV audience best mirrors the national demographic profile, while linear TV only viewing is beginning to really concentrate in older demographics. We also had an interesting stat contributed by Samsung. So since January 2020 to May 2021, traditional TV viewing rose by 17%. I think all consumption has generally risen. CTV consumption rose by 55%. So a much faster acceleration. And within that CTV acceleration, also AVOD is starting to take a more prominent position, where previously I think SVOD was fairly dominant. It seems like we're reaching a level now where people are ready to supplement an already pretty saturated SVOD selection with AVOD services. So that's a huge opportunity, obviously, for advertisers. And then, just thinking about what Vicky was saying as well around connected teams, was it connected planning across linear and CTV? Hugely important. We found that 71% of European audiences are now hybrid TV viewers, i.e. they watch some combination of linear and CTV. So I don't think it could be, it's as important as ever to think about what the right balance is, depending on your objectives and target audience, and obviously on that side of linear and CTV activations. But it feels as though CTV needs to be considered in most television activations, today. So you'll be hearing us talk about that research, I'm sure, a lot in the next few weeks. But those were some of the key insights.
And you mentioned, linear TV, CTV activations, and previously, both Bart and Vicky have spoken about the responsibility struggle within agencies. And I think these two things, what you mentioned and what Bart and Vicky mentioned, really bring home a very important point, which is the metrics. So let's look at the buying metrics. Does the panel, do you all think that CTV will be bought on GRPs or on impressions? Is it going to be a digital way of thinking, or is it going to be a TV way of thinking, or something entirely different depending on the market? Who wants to start? Patrick, maybe. Yeah,
I'll go ahead. So I think there's value in both, but I think we have to have a look back in terms of and the different markets to start with. GRP, obviously with TV works in terms of the UK market, you have Barb. Everyone buys into that, is the gold standard in terms of you have all of the broadcasters buying in. So you have a uniformed and a unity behind that metric. So you're able to use that currency and sell off that and optimize off that. And it works very well for agencies and clients who are buying into that. With connected TV right now, as with the rest of the digital market, you don't have a gold standard unified currency that we all use or measure against or use for reporting. So it's very difficult to establish any sort of form of using GRP without that. It's jumping ahead too far. I think the first instance, what needs to happen is unified measurement, and tools like Unified ID 2.0, which is what the Trade Desk is a big champion of and done some work with, getting behind these sorts of new technologies that can replace third-party cookie, can be used for different beneficial purposes, particularly within connected TV, because TV companies at the moment, specifically in BVOD, those established broadcasters, haven't been able to provide anything to their clients in terms of measurement tools. You know, Project Dovetail was something that Barb has been working on for many years, still not got there. You have C-Flight now, which is coming out, but there's still that fragmentation between the different providers. A independent sort of measurement tool is what's needed here. And then the discussion can begin in terms of looking back on how you measure that. Do you still work on impressions and GRPs? But from a personal opinion, looking at the differences, I think impressions still provide more precise and more insight, more transparency for the measurement purposes that we operate in CTV. And it plays a different role than linear. It plays a different part in that marketing funnel. So I think for me, it would be impressions, but we've got some time before we get to that debate, I think.
And Vicky, from an agency perspective, I think, again, integrated teams, no silos.
I think you're right, Patrick. I don't think ratings are going anywhere from the TV landscape anytime soon. And I guess it's up to us as planners to figure out how we bring that together. I kind of like to think it's best to broadcast, and then how you use your addressable data-led channels as well. So you have to bring those two together. But my caution, a strong caution, is that impressions aren't views. And we absolutely need to, if we're going to talk about impressions, then we have to then talk about additional view-through rates. So you have another level of detail that comes in. You cannot compare ratings and impressions. You have to bring together what is a view, and then you can start to align some of these channels. And as you said, while we wait for the next stage of total measurement, which we're hoping, there are some solutions around the corner that we're all very interested in watching, seeing what happens there. We have to do that heavy lifting ourselves at the agency level to bring plans together.
Right. And just a quick note to the audience, please do feel free to ask questions, type them in the question box. We'll have around 5 minutes at the end to address a few of those. So please fire away if there's anything you'd like to ask the panelists. From measurement to the programmatic infrastructure, I've showed in my presentation that programmatic continues to grow and is kind of moving up the funnel into new formats, including CTV. And separately at IAB Europe, we just launched a guide to programmatic CTV advertising. Bart, Ed, I know you've been involved there. What kind of buying metrics, what kind of KPIs are we currently seeing in programmatic CTV?
Yeah, absolutely. Particularly on the programmatic activations, yes, we are from pure buying metric standpoint, it's a CPM activation. Obviously, as Vicky just stated, if we're trying to pitch this in the context of broader based TV, then completed views is obviously a key metric. That's not today a buying metric in programmatic, but considering that we're talking about professionally produced long form content with ad pods, we see view through rates at 95% plus. So when we track back to an effective cost per completed view, which is a stat we typically provide to buyers, those levels are pretty competitive. It is entirely, it is, I'd say 95% deal driven today, be it direct sold or a programmatic type execution, programmatic guaranteed, non-guaranteed PMPs. We haven't yet seen an adoption in open market buying strategies. I think that's meaningful yet in Europe.
In a supply constrained market.
What's that?
Which would be slightly suspicious in a supply constrained market.
Absolutely, absolutely, yeah. And you know, equally from a kind of data activation standpoint, we're not talking about browser-based environments anymore. There is not a wealth of third-party data sets that can be applied to this inventory. In fact, but however, conversely, there is a lot of unique first-party data sets that sit on the media or the device manufacturer side that can be activated. So we're seeing deterministic, light linear viewer segments, heavy streamers, contextual first-party data also being applied. So those are some of the key trends I think that we're seeing, how this is being traded programmatically. And post-campaign, we strive to provide a unique device measurement. That's a one-to-one kind of audience size measurement, incremental reach to linear activations, brand uplift studies. These are all stuff that we look to append to these programmatic activations.
And Bart, from your side, what kind of data are you making available? How are you enabling programmatic buyers?
In general, I think it's a very immature space still, even from our point of view. In terms of the buying metrics, like I think most of them touched upon, in my opinion, almost always going to be CPM. But you do have buyers that are looking at like, how can we translate that into GRPs, for instance, although they still, agree that buying CPM is probably the way to go. And then you can start looking into, is it possible to start transact cost per completed view model, as Ed pointed to? And I think there's, with the current metrics that we are seeing on our side, I think on average between 95 and 98% completion rates on CTV make it very clear that you can actually almost start transacting on views instead of impressions, because the risks seem to be very low. Similar for viewability. And I think once you start covering all of those elements in a much better way, then I think a while ago, Google started with this viewable CPM model, and I think that might be something that you can eventually, moving forward, introduce into CTV as well. So yeah, I think more and more it's going to be about the actual impact of CTV, which, if you come to the data point, we will be able to provide much more data moving forward. I think the contribution into the CTV guy was also very much around contextual from my point of view. And I think contextual is going to make a big comeback in this space. And I think it will also really help buyers make sense of what it is that they're buying, instead of all of these third-party data metrics that they've previously been looking at for video, buying on interests or otherwise, because it's a household device and you'll have multiple people in the room. So it's always going to be hard to target that individual. And instead, you should be looking at how can we make this message relevant to the context in which it's being viewed, or the time it's being watched, or whatever it might be. So I think that's going to be the transition of CTV in the coming years.
Before we move to questions, just very quickly, 30-second each, real talk. We're in a very nascent market still. What needs to happen in the next 6 to 12 months to really accelerate CTV growth in Europe? What's the key priority? Vicky, I'm going to start with you.
Okay, I think we need to really clear on the role for channel. I think we need to, as planners, make sure that there's 4 things that needs to be in place: the content, the platform, the data, and the audience measurement, to make sure that we build out our tapestry of sort of total television solutions.
Ed?
I think number one prioritization is the measurement challenge, trying to tackle that, stand up and be measured. That's been a huge source of growth, of investment for us, certainly, is to offer measurement that deterministically shows incremental reach that's driven. Outside of that, I think we're likely to see more collaboration between broadcasters. There's so much movement going on in that space. I think we're going to see more inventory being enabled for programmatic as well. So not just what we can't say traditional CTV, but addressable TV, set-top box inventory, HbbTV, coming to programmatic. I think this is a trend that we're likely to see as well coming up.
Patrick, from your perspective.
Yeah, I completely agree with Ed in terms of, I think, the uniformity or the unity amongst broadcasters, but also the OTT first publishers coming together, realizing that this is a unified landscape in terms of connected TV, certainly come together. And the second thing, I think, also partly answers Simon Thomas's question, which is measurement, and Vicky's point and Ed's point, is something that is a unified identifier in terms of bringing together and helping that activation. So we're not reliant just in terms of impressions or GRPs. Unified ID measurement can also provide intuition and information around what happens after the person has seen that advert without any PII getting misleading. So it's all around privacy safe but intuitive advertising.
Bart, some quick final comment.
They said some very sensible things on the measurement piece, and I think that totally makes sense. The measurement challenge will be around, I'd call it uniformity in setting a measurement solution that brings parity to the market and brings all the manufacturers and broadcasters together through unified measurement solutions. And what that means is that collaboration needs to happen between TV manufacturers, streaming providers like ourselves, and broadcasters. And if and when that happens, I think that's when you can start seeing developments in this space. The TV manufacturers have this possibility. Other partners in the ecosystem need to start working together with them as well in order to get that moving.
Brilliant. Fantastic. And I see lots of great questions pouring in. Just very quickly, I think we can only answer a few. First one was started at my presentation at a big logo soup, which isn't a Volumascape, just a logo soup. Will that persist, or will we see after mergers and acquisitions much fewer logos? I think we're going to see both. We're going to see the logos change. So we see consolidation on the one hand, but also fragmentation on the other. I believe the markets will be predominantly evolved on a national basis still. International collaboration, apart from some examples, I believe in the next 2 years will remain limited as national markets with their own trading cultures need to adopt. More M&A, yes. On this, at the same time, I think we're going to see more fragmentation in the service layer. So not just streaming services, but in particular those who are able to orchestrate. Specialist vendors who can map and measure across walled gardens, that's going to become essential. I think we already answered partly the next questions about why we're still talking about GRPs and impressions. Quickly to the panel, what are the main challenges faced by publishers on making their CTV inventory available programmatically? I think there might be a bit of trauma going back in 2009, what happened there. Anyone wants to comment on that?
I think Bart probably is the best person to lead it off as the publisher of the broadcast on the chat.
I think it's definitely been challenging the last year or so to get more activations through programmatic because of the different DSPs that you're working with and everyone having their own levels of brand safety, privacy settings, etc., that sometimes make it difficult to transact through those DSPs, and you don't really know what's causing it not to transact. But typically it's things around consent strings, full consent strings, GDPR strings that are either being passed through, or it's binary consent or otherwise. And similarly, some of the content can't be accurately mapped to a specific ID, and then it gets filtered out. And so I think those have been some main challenges, but I think mostly we've solved them with the bigger DSPs, and some smaller DSPs, we're still figuring some of these issues out. But in most cases, I think we're nearly there in terms of bringing almost all of our supply to programmatic.
Last question, particularly to Patrick and Ed, about contextual. What are the current solutions available for contextual? What is the roadmap of making it available via programmatic? And what's the role of first and third-party data in this process? Anyone of you wants to pick that?
I actually think that content metadata is a short-term focus, that we should be looking to create consistency across how CTV providers are categorizing their content. You've got Nielsen codes, you've got IAB taxonomies, you've got custom taxonomies across the broadcasters. But on the other side, we know that there's appetite to get genre-based targeting, program, show, and so on and so forth. So that is actually a key focus, because right now it's disparate across providers, and that's likely hindering further investment. Yeah, so that's a good question.
I think that's all that we have time for today. Oh, sorry, did you want to just...
I was literally just going to add, in terms of, it ties nicely into the ask question that you had around the challenges facing the broadcasters and around this, which is first party data. You have to protect your viewers. Ultimately, from a broadcaster perspective, they're number one. So protecting their interests, and that can be one of the challenges. You want to inform those advertising solutions. You want to provide better data for the advertisers, but you also got to remember the viewing experience. And that's where, you know, a lot of the broadcasters and the publishers who have been successful in this route in terms of evolving their products and moving it into and providing better targeting and more data, they've taken that into consideration first on preventing things like CMPs. But that's the biggest challenge in moving into that space, but also evolving the product and providing products like Ed was talking about.
Fantastic, great. I think that's all that we have time for. Thank you very much to all my fantastic panelists. I think we could continue discussing this for hours. It shows lots of momentum in the market, but many moving parts to be sorted out. Thank you to the audience for your fantastic questions, and I look forward to resuming this discussion with all of you over the next couple of months. And with that, we'll pass back to Ryan. Thank you.